Thanks for the invitation. Sorry, I'm not speaking in French, but I'll do my best. The last decade in Brazil was pretty much important. Brazil experienced faster growth, along with an important decrease, an important improvement in income distribution, and this was the first time that Brazil experienced that. We see here this chart with GDP per capita, IMF figures, and Gini coefficient, the lower the better, and we see that the last decade we saw this sharp improvement in Gini coefficient with an important acceleration in GDP per capita. There are several reasons for that, and this improvement in income distribution actually started under Cardoso's administration, and then after, with Lula, we had this movement being reinforced. Under Cardoso's administration, I can say that lower inflation was a very important variable, because we know that lower classes, they could not defend themselves from higher inflation. Higher inflation every month eroding their payments, their wages. And also the government started a policy of bolder adjustments in minimum wage. And then we have, under Lula's administration, aside from lower inflation and bolder minimum wage adjustment, there was also cash transfer programs, the Bolsa Família, which is a wise way to transfer cash for this part of population that needs some help from, some support from the government, because the cash transfer depends on keeping the children at school. So this is really important for Brazil, considering the low levels of formal education in the country. Another point that was really important, actually, it was, in my opinion, the key variable, was the formalization of the labor market. So workers with registered contracts. It's really important in Brazil. Back in the 80s, I would say that informality would be something above 50% in Brazil, and nowadays it's pretty much below something like 35 when we take the whole economy, not only the labor market. So it really matters. This idea of a better income distribution, of course, is closely related to the emergence of middle class. We had 25 million people crossing the poverty line, 35 million people entering in the middle class, and what some studies say is that two-thirds of one of the important explanation, or something like two-thirds, the importance of the improvement in income distribution is one of the biggest reasons for the emergence of the middle class. Let's move on. Well, apparently this move is still underway. Probably you're going to have almost 120 million people in the middle class in the next 8 years, I mean in 2020. Today's 53% of population, 100 million people. This move is still underway, and I think the reasons for that is that education is slowly improving in Brazil. It's a slow movement, but it still is on the right direction. Demographics also help, and we need to remember that what's driving growth in Brazil has been demand and services, commerce. These sectors are labor intensive, so they also contribute for increasing occupation in Brazil. But it's important to understand that these cash transfers, although they were indeed important, other variables were critical for this emergence of middle class, and it was basically labor productivity. So if you trying to to do a breakdown of the main factors that explain the emergence of middle class, I would say that kind of 40% has to do, 40% has to do with higher productivity, labor productivity. 30% would be cash transfers programs. 20% demographics, more adults. The dependency ratio is lower in Brazil now. And 10% is job creation in itself. So there is indeed a part of this move that it's related not to government policies, but to productivity growth. And once this person finds a job, is a formal job, one important element here is that usually this person will have access to health insurance, which means that ultimately the disposable income will increase, and of course health increases as well, improves as well, and their productivity. So education plus health, of course, two important elements to boost productivity gains. Another point is that once you have a formal job, you're able to enter in the credit market. So we had a substantial increase in credit to individuals in Brazil in the last decade. It was 5% of GDP in 01, 02, and currently 16% of GDP. I mean only credit to individuals. In this, I refer here to non-earmarked credit, not the total credit. Bank lending, of course, there is, we see in the first chart that there has been a deceleration, but it's a cyclical deceleration. But overall, I would say that Brazil continues to show decent credit growth. And this formalization, of course, of the economy, of course, contributed to this acceleration in bank lending, and it's a participation in the GDP, but it's not only that. Again, some important measures carried out in the beginning of Lula's administration. They stimulated credit via new credit instruments, basically, and also measures to improve the quality and the execution of guarantees. So the environment for banks became more secure, and of course, this meant an increase in the supply of credit by banks as well. This is, again, really important for productivity gains because, again, an individual or a company, once they enter in the credit market, it means more investments by these companies and more productivity gains as well. So several elements contributed to consumption and it's not only, I mean, it's not only the improvement of income distribution that explains this acceleration in consumption in Brazil. It also has to do with credit growth and productivity, higher productivity, especially in services in Brazil. Well, and does growth depend on the middle class? Well, this is of course that consumption has been an important growth driver in Brazil. But I think it's important to understand that we are seeing now an important deceleration, so I try to explore a little bit that why consumption remains robust, but GDP growth is disappointing, has been disappointing. Well, first let's take a look at this chart. What I do here is I put the Gini coefficient and household consumption, and we see that the improvement in income distribution came before the acceleration in consumption growth. So this gives us a hint that other variables were important, and of course my point here is that credit growth was really critical for that. So what I call here for other structural factors explaining household consumption, this is basically credit. Aside from that, there is also cyclical factors. We know that the emergence of middle class did not occur only in Brazil. This is a global phenomena, and some countries could capture more than others. There's a benefit from the external cycle. Brazil, of course, could be benefit by that, as some important measures were carried out in the beginning of last decade, as I have already mentioned. And domestic policies reinforcing this benign cycle. But what was exactly the importance of the external cycle? Well, we should remember that Brazil in the past used to have external restrictions, I mean running current account deficits, low capital inflows, and every time the government tried to accelerate growth, inflation or deterioration in current account just put a limit to growth, and we have what we call the stop and go cycle, short-term growth followed by a recession. So what's the idea is that when we start the last decade with the benign world cycle, of course, Brazil could improve the external indicators. Brazil was granted investment grade, as you know. Brazil is currently net creditor in US dollars, so there is not a problem of external solvency, meaning that all those policies to stimulate consumption, they could, of course, be prolonged because the inflation remained low and with no problems at all in terms of external financing. So when we take a look here in the first chart, we see that exports as percentage of GDP, they started to accelerate with the beginning of last decade, and it drove the current accounts to the surplus side, and of course it was important to finance consumption in Brazil. We have this other chart, becomes really clear when we see consumption versus exports as percentage of GDP.
We don't have much time left.
Okay, I'm just finishing here. So what we see is that it's solid consumption indeed is important for Brazil, but it's not enough to keep robust growth. This is what we've learned recently. And the idea is that what really drives growth is productivity gains, is not consumption. In the short run, you can stimulate consumption, but if you want to have long-lasting cycle, you need to also stimulate productivity gains. This is what's missing in Brazil. Brazil needs more investments. In this first chart, we can take a look here. The performance of industrial production in Brazil compared to emerging economies and compared to the world economy. We have a clear decoupling of industrial production in Brazil. And it's not only currency appreciation that is causing that. I would say that we need also to consider the infrastructure costs that have been rising and labor costs as well. Of course, if we have this middle class consuming a lot and an imbalance between supply and demand. Labor market is really tight, so it means higher labor costs to manufacturing, eroding their competitiveness. And of course, this gap has been closed, this gap between supply and demand has been closed by imports. So we see an increase in the penetration of imports in Brazil. It's now 22% from our consumption, and it was almost 10% lower 10 years ago. Lastly, the final words is that consumption is doing fine, middle class is doing fine, this improvement is still underway, but Brazil needs to shift its political agenda to more productivity gains in order to accelerate growth again and keep this improvement in labor income, and avoid, of course, setbacks in income distribution. It's really important to see a change of this political agenda. Political agenda during Cardoso's administration was clearly the macro stabilization, fight against inflation and privatization, and then we have Lula. We had Lula accelerating the improvement in income distribution, but what's next? We are not seeing clear signals from current administration, but hopefully, I think this new middle class will help Brazil to renew this political agenda. That's it.
Thank you.